Hello and welcome. I'm Stephen, and we're really excited to have you join me for today's webinar on one of the most important and timely topics in the medical device space, navigating UKCA marking and compliance in a post-Brexit regulatory environment. So, let me start with a number that might surprise you. Over 80% of medical devices used in the UK were previously CE marked under EU regulations. That means thousands of manufacturers, both in the UK and globally, are now racing to secure UKCA certification to continue selling their products in the Great British market. But here's the challenge. Only a handful of UK approved bodies are available to process these applications, creating potential bottlenecks and delays that could affect market access. And the question is your company ready? So before Brexit, the UK followed the familiar CE marking system. But now, with regulatory divergence, the UK has introduced the UK Conformity Assessed UKCA marking. This new framework means that if you want to sell medical devices in Great Britain, that's England, Scotland or Wales, you need UKCA certification. Meanwhile, for manufacturers still operating in the EU, CE marking remains essential. So this shift has left manufacturers facing a dual compliance landscape, where navigating separate regulatory frameworks is the new reality. And while the transition period does offer some flexibility, companies that don't start preparing now risk major disruptions. But it's not all bad news. There are also some opportunities that come with this. So the UK's evolving regulatory framework is designed to support innovation and ensure patient safety. And manufacturers that understand these changes early will be well positioned for long-term success. And that's exactly why we're here today. So by the end of this session, you'll have a clear roadmap for UKCA compliance, including what UKCA marking is and why it matters, and how it impacts manufacturers and market access, how UKCA differs from CE marking, and what you need to know to maintain compliance in both markets, the biggest challenges manufacturers are facing with UKCA implementation, and most importantly, how to overcome them. And finally, best practices to ensure a smooth and successful transition to UKCA certification. And as always, if you have any questions after today's webinar, drop them in the comments below, or alternatively, email your questions directly to us at ridian@ridianresourcehub.com. We'll tackle a few questions we've received already in our Q&A session at the end, and we'll make sure to respond to all further questions received by email or in the comments below. So, what is UKCA marking and why does it matter? Let's start with the basics. Think back to a few years ago. If you wanted to sell a medical device in the UK, all you needed was a CE marking, a single certification that granted access to both the EU and UK markets. It was an efficient, unified system. But then Brexit changed the rules. The UK chose to establish its own independent regulatory framework, introducing UKCA, UK Conformity Assessed, as the new standard for placing medical devices on the market in England, Scotland and Wales. So this shift is more than just a regulatory formality. It has direct impact on market access, business strategy and patient safety. If your device doesn't have UKCA certification, it simply won't be legally allowed on the British market once the transition period ends. So why is this such a big deal? To put things into perspective, we'll look at the numbers. In 2020, the UK medical device market was valued at over 10 billion, which is a huge market opportunity. But if you haven't secured UKCA marking in time, you risk losing access to that market completely. So it's not just a matter of ticking a regulatory box, it's about business continuity. If we look at a real world example, imagine you're a medtech company that produces a cutting edge diagnostic device for early cancer detection. Before Brexit, you could obtain CE marking and sell in both the EU and UK without any additional approvals. Now, you need separate UKCA certification if you want to continue operating in Britain. And if you don't secure it in time, you face delays, likely lost revenue and restricted market access. Meanwhile, your competitors who are quick to transition to UKCA will maintain uninterrupted sales and market access, leaving you struggling to catch up. So one of the most important things to understand about UKCA marking is timing. Right now, there's a transition period where CE marking is still temporarily accepted in the UK, but this window isn't staying open forever. And once it closes, any device that hasn't secured UKCA certification must be withdrawn from the market. And here's the catch. Transitioning isn't instant. Regulatory approvals take time. So if you wait too long, you'll find yourself stuck in a backlog of last-minute applications, facing likely approval delays, supply chain disruptions, and potential financial losses. The MHRA has made it clear that post-Brexit, the UK will operate under its own distinct framework, and if you don't comply, you will not be given a free pass. So if we now take a step back and look beyond compliance, as we discussed previously, the UKCA marking isn't just about meeting legal requirements. It plays a critical role in ensuring patient safety and maintaining product quality. And these regulatory standards exist for a reason. They ensure that every device on the market is safe, effective, and manufactured to a high standard. And the UKCA framework is built on these principles, incorporating stronger post-market surveillance to monitor device performance over time, risk management processes that align with ISO 14971, ensuring potential hazards are identified and mitigated, and more rigorous quality management aligned with ISO 13485, which reinforces best practices for manufacturing and supply chain integrity. So for you, manufacturers, this means higher levels of scrutiny, but also greater trust in your products. Compliance is about demonstrating that your device meets the highest safety and performance standards. So here's the reality. If you act early and transition to UKCA marking before the final deadline, you will gain a competitive advantage. You'll avoid the stress of last-minute compliance, you'll avoid regulatory bottlenecks, and you'll be able to maintain uninterrupted sales in the UK. On the other hand, if you delay, you'll face longer approval times due to surge in last-minute applications, lost market share as competitors who secured UKCA early continue selling without disruption, and potential financial strain from urgent compliance costs and regulatory penalties. So ultimately, UKCA marking is a strategic business decision. The manufacturers that navigate this transition efficiently will emerge stronger, more resilient, and better positioned for long-term success in the UK. So, now that we've established why the UKCA marking is so important, the next step is understanding how it compares to CE marking. What exactly are the differences? How do you comply with both UK and EU regulations without unnecessary duplication? And what steps should you take to streamline your approval process? So, UKCA compliance versus CE marking, the key differences. Now that we've covered what UKCA marking is and why it matters, let's take a closer look at how it compares to CE marking and what you need to navigate this new landscape. At first glance, UKCA and CE marking might seem quite similar. After all, before Brexit, the UK followed the same EU directives as the rest of Europe. But as the UK moves towards a more independent regulatory framework, important differences are emerging. And if you manufacture or distribute medical devices, understanding these changes is essential to keeping your products on the market in both the UK and the EU. So, what's different? Before Brexit, things were simple. You, as a medical device manufacturer, could obtain a CE marking through an EU notified body and sell that product across both the EU and the UK. No extra approvals needed. But that's no longer the case. Now, under UKCA, devices intended for the British market must be assessed and approved by a UK approved body instead of an EU notified body. In other words, you now need to go through two separate regulatory processes if you want to continue selling in both regions. For some companies, this shift won't be a major hurdle, as, for example, some Class 1 devices can still be self-certified under both UKCA and CE marking without additional oversight. But for higher risk devices, Class 2A, Class 2B and Class 3, the process is much more complex. These devices now require separate conformity assessments under each system, meaning you must engage with both an EU notified body and a UK approved body if you want to maintain dual market access. If you previously relied on a single submission for both markets, this adds a layer of complexity, it adds a layer of time and cost. You must now carefully coordinate approvals across two different authorities, ensuring that your technical documentation, post-market surveillance and quality management systems align with both UK and EU requirements. And that's just the start. As we touched on earlier, compliance is also about timing. The UK has chosen to phase in UKCA marking, allowing you to continue using CE marking for now. Currently, the UK will continue to recognise CE marking until June the 30th, 2030 for some medical devices. Now that may seem like a long way off, but there are key deadlines along the way that you need to plan for and have already met. One of the biggest milestones that we've just passed is January the 1st, 2025. From this date, all UKCA marked devices must display a UK manufacturer or importer address on product labelling. Now this might seem like a minor detail, but failing to comply means products could be stuck in customs, delayed in distribution, or even removed from the market entirely. For global manufacturers that distribute in both the UK and EU, this means a major packaging and documentation update, one that should have been planned well in advance to avoid costly last-minute changes. Now, as if things weren't complicated enough already, Northern Ireland operates under a different set of rules. So unlike England, Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland still follows EU MDR and IVDR. That means CE marking remains valid there, and devices assessed by an EU notified body can still be sold without any additional UKCA approval. But here's where things can get slightly tricky. If a device is assessed by a UK approved body, meaning it has a UKCA mark, it cannot be sold in Northern Ireland unless it also carries a special CE UKNI marking. Now, this hybrid regulatory status creates an extra challenge if you're selling across the entire UK. It forces you to carefully navigate multiple regulatory pathways depending on where your product is being sold. If you're distributing in both Great Britain and Northern Ireland, this means you need to maintain separate approval routes depending on which market you're targeting. It's an additional layer of complexity that requires careful planning and regulatory expertise. So, moving on to why dual compliance is now essential. While UKCA and CA marking share some common ground, their approval pathways are no longer interchangeable. If you're looking to operate across multiple regions, there's only one solution: a dual compliance strategy. That means working with both an EU notified body and a UK approved body to maintain seamless market access, ensuring your technical documentation, quality management systems and post-market surveillance align with both regulatory frameworks. In addition, you have to adapt labelling, packaging and your supply chain logistics to meet both UKCA and CE requirements. So the manufacturers that get ahead of this challenge, planning early, streamlining compliance processes and working closely with the right regulatory partners, will be the ones that maintain uninterrupted market access and a competitive advantage. On the other hand, if you delay or underestimate the complexity of dual compliance, you risk serious consequences. As we mentioned earlier, you'll risk approval backlogs, supply chain disruptions, and loss of market access. So, now we know how UKCA differs from CE marking and why a dual compliance strategy is so important. But what are the biggest challenges you as manufacturers are facing in this transition? And more importantly, how can you overcome them? And that's exactly what we'll cover next. We'll take a look at the most common compliance roadblocks and the practical steps you can take to navigate them smoothly. So, overcoming common compliance challenges. We've covered what UKCA marking is and how it differs from CE marking, but let's get real. Understanding the regulation is one thing, actually making the transition is another. And for many of you, that's where the real challenge begins. The shift to UKCA isn't just about changing a label. It's a fundamental change in how medical devices are regulated in Britain. And for many manufacturers, it's proving to be more complex and time-consuming than expected. There are a few key hurdles that keep coming up, and if they aren't addressed, they could cause you major disruptions to your product availability, compliance timelines, and overall business strategy. Let's start with one of the biggest challenges, the sheer amount of extra regulatory work involved. Before Brexit, you could secure one CE marking and sell your devices across both the EU and the UK. That system was simple, the system was efficient. But now, as we've previously discussed, you must obtain separate UKCA approval for the British market, which means maintaining two sets of regulatory approvals, two sets of technical files, and two separate compliance processes. And that's not just extra paperwork. It's double the time, double the cost, and double the effort. And let's not forget, many of you are still adjusting to the EU's MDR and IVDR requirements, which replace the older MDD framework with much stricter compliance rules. Adding UKCA on top of that creates a serious challenge, especially if you're already stretched pretty thin. For some of you, it probably feels like you're constantly updating technical files, rewriting compliance reports, and submitting new applications, all just to keep selling the same device in the same markets they were already in. But even if you have all your documentation in order, there's still another challenge waiting: the limited number of UK approved bodies. Unlike the EU, which has dozens of notified bodies to process CE marking applications, the UK has a much smaller pool of approved bodies to handle UKCA certifications. And that might not seem like a problem now, but as the transition deadline gets closer, these bodies will see a surge in applications. And what happens when demand spikes? Delays, backlogs, longer approval times. If you wait too long to start your UKCA process, you may find yourself stuck in a queue, unable to get your devices approved in time. And without certification, those products can't be legally placed on the British market. If you have complex supply chains or just-in-time manufacturing models, even a small delay in regulatory approval could create serious disruptions, stopping sales, halting production, and causing ripple effects throughout your entire distribution network. And then, on top of that, there's another layer of complexity, one that many UK manufacturers aren't fully prepared for, and that's the UK responsible person requirement. If you're based outside the UK, getting UKCA approval isn't all just paperwork. It also requires appointing a UK responsible person, or UKRP. And this isn't just a formality. The UKRP acts as your official representative in Britain, liaising with the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or the MHRA for short, ensuring compliance and holding technical documentation for you for inspection. For manufacturers that previously relied on an EU-based authorised representative, this adds a new layer of administrative work. The UK responsible person must be in place before the UKCA certification can be finalised, meaning that non-UK companies can't afford to delay this step if they want to keep selling in Britain. So, with all of these challenges stacking up, what's the best way to stay ahead? The key to success: start preparing now. Manufacturers that start their UKCA transition early will be in the best position possible. Waiting until the final deadline is risky. Regulators will be overwhelmed, and if you aren't ready, you could find yourself facing serious setbacks. The solution? Proactive planning. Manufacturers that begin working on UKCA compliance now will have more control over the transition process, greater flexibility in dealing with regulatory changes, and, most importantly, a smoother path to maintaining market access. And that brings us nicely to the next crucial step: how to implement UKCA compliance efficiently while minimising disruption. Okay, so best practices for seamless UKCA implementation. We've already talked about the challenges of transitioning to UKCA marking. Now, let's focus on the solutions, because while the process does require careful planning, it doesn't need to be overwhelming. The key is knowing where to start and how to move through the steps efficiently without unnecessary delays or compliance roadblocks. For most of you watching this, the question isn't, do we need UKCA marking? That's already clear. The real challenge is how to implement it smoothly whilst keeping your business operations running as usual. And the good news, there are a few strategies that can make all the difference. Start with a regulatory gap analysis. If your device is already CE marked, you have a head start, but that doesn't mean that UKCA compliance is automatic. While the two systems share similarities, there are key differences in documentation, labelling and technical requirements that can create unexpected compliance gaps. The best approach is to take a detailed look at your existing CE documentation and compare it with UKCA requirements. Are there any missing conformity assessments? Do risk management reports meet UK expectations? Are labelling requirements fully aligned? Identifying these gaps early gives you time to update your clinical evidence, adjust your documentation, and fine-tune your submissions before beginning the certification process. Next, secure an approved body early. As we mentioned earlier, even if you have all your documentation in order, there's another challenge that could slow things down: limited availability of UK approved bodies. This creates a real risk of bottlenecks, especially as more manufacturers rush to get certified before key deadlines. Some manufacturers are already seeing approval delays of 12 months or more, which could put your business at risk if you wait too long to begin the process. The best way to avoid this is to engage with an approved body as early as possible. The sooner an application is in the queue, the less likely it is to be affected by backlogs. If you delay, you could find yourself unable to sell your products in the UK simply because you waited too long to get certification. Establish a clear UK compliance strategy. Make use of UK-based regulatory consultancies, or have the right team in place for this internally. If you're selling in both the UK and the EU, keeping track of two separate regulatory pathways can quickly become complicated. The risk of mix-ups, duplicated work, or conflicting submissions is high, especially for manufacturers handling compliance across multiple markets. That's why many manufacturers are choosing to use a dedicated UK regulatory consultancy to manage UKCA requirements separately from CE marking. This ensures that UK-specific compliance are met without confusion, reducing the risk of errors that could lead to delays. A structured approach to UKCA compliance will help you stay organised, efficient, and fully prepared as deadlines approach. Next, strengthen your post-market surveillance processes. Certification is just the beginning. Once your device is on the market, you must track its performance, monitor safety signals, and submit reports to the MHRA to demonstrate ongoing compliance. The UK is aligning more closely with global post-market surveillance standards, which means you need to be prepared for greater scrutiny, stronger safety monitoring, and more detailed reporting requirements. One key development is the introduction of a UDI, Unique Device Identification, which improves traceability and helps regulators track medical devices more effectively. Manufacturers that integrate UDI tracking into their supply chains now will be in a stronger position to meet future compliance expectations with less disruption and greater regulatory confidence. So, what's the takeaway? Successful UKCA implementation isn't just about meeting deadlines. It's about being strategic, proactive, and well prepared. By taking a proactive approach, conducting a regulatory gap analysis, securing an approved body early, maintaining a structured compliance process, and strengthening your post-market surveillance, you will find the transition far smoother and with minimal business disruption. The reality is, UKCA is here to stay. Plan ahead, work efficiently, and stay ahead of compliance challenges, and you'll be in the strongest possible position to maintain market access and stay competitive. So, now that we've covered the key steps for successful UKCA transition, we'll take a look at some of your most frequently asked questions. Before we wrap up, we'll look at some of the most pressing questions about UKCA compliance, real specific concerns that manufacturers are dealing with right now. If these have been on your mind, you're not alone. First question, how long does UKCA certification actually take? So, the timeline for UKCA certification depends entirely on your device classification and the availability of an approved body. If you manufacture Class 1 devices, such as bandages, surgical instruments, or reusable scalpels, for most, you can self-certify on the UKCA, just as you could under CE marking. That means the process is relatively fast, provided your technical documentation, risk assessment, and labelling are fully aligned with UKCA requirements. For higher risk devices, so Class 2A, 2B, and 3, it's a different story. You have to work with a UK approved body to conduct a conformity assessment, which can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months, depending again on a few factors. Number one will be the complexity of the device. So for devices like active implantable devices, AI-based software, high-risk diagnostic tools, they often face lengthy reviews due to stricter safety assessments. Number two will be the completeness of your submission. If your technical file is incomplete or your clinical data isn't robust enough, the approved body will likely request additional evidence, which can add weeks or even months to the process. Third, the capacity of the UK approved bodies. So unlike the EU, which has north of 40 notified bodies, the UK currently only has a handful of approved bodies that handle UKCA applications, which could mean waiting over a year for certification. So if your device requires an approved body assessment, you just simply can't afford to wait. Contact a UK approved body as soon as possible to check their availability and their certification timeline. Next question. Will the UK's regulatory framework diverge further from EU MDR? This is one of the biggest unknowns, but the early signs suggest that yes, UKCA requirements will continue to evolve separately from EU MDR. Right now, UKCA and CE marking are largely aligned, meaning that if your device complies with EU MDR or IVDR, you're already meeting many of the same core safety and performance standards. However, the MHRA has made it clear that it plans to move towards a more tailored UK regulatory system. We're already seeing the first signs of divergence, greater focus on post-market surveillance. The UK is aligning more closely with global PMS frameworks, meaning manufacturers will need to conduct real-world performance monitoring of devices post-approval, submit periodic safety update reports to the MHRA, even for low-risk devices, implement proactive risk mitigation plans based on real-world data, mandatory unique device identification, UDI implementation. So by mid-2025, manufacturers of Class 3 and Class 2B devices should really expect UDI compliance to become a strict enforcement priority, meaning you'll have to have a UDI tracking fully integrated into your supply chain well in advance. Also seeing potential streamlining for UKCA certification, which it indicates that it's exploring a more flexible risk-based approach to device approvals. This could mean reduced reliance on conformity assessments for low-risk devices and more UK-specific approval processes that differ from the EU model. So you shouldn't assume that UKCA will always mirror the EU MDR. If your regulatory strategy is based on maintaining a single set of documents for both markets, you really need to start planning for divergence now. especially in areas like PMS reporting, UDI compliance, and device risk categorization. Next question is, what happens if I miss the UKCA deadline? So if you don't obtain UKCA marking before the deadline, simple, you will not be legally allowed on the UK market. So the UK government has confirmed that the CE marking will be recognised in Britain until June the 30th, 2030, but that doesn't mean you have until 2030 to act. For many devices, compliance deadlines will tighten well before then. For example, as we discussed previously, from January 1st, 2025, all UKCA marked devices must display a UK manufacturer or importer address on the label. So this means non-UK manufacturers must appoint a UK responsible person immediately if they haven't done so already. Packaging and labeling will need to be redesigned and printed well in advance, especially for companies that distribute across multiple markets. Higher risk devices face earlier compliance deadlines. Many of these devices will require full UKCA conformity assessments well before 2030, and if you miss the submission window, you could be stuck waiting over a year for approval. Retailers, distributors, and healthcare providers will also start prioritising UKCA compliant products even before the final CE recognition deadline. Hospitals and procurement agencies may start requiring UKCA marked devices as standard. So waiting until 2029 or even 2030 shouldn't and isn't an option. The earlier deadlines mean that manufacturers need to start preparing now. Final takeaways from this webinar. At this point, the message really should be clear. UKCA compliance is not something to push to the last minute. Manufacturers to take action now, whether by securing an approved body, adapting to new post-market surveillance requirements, or ensuring supply chain readiness, will be the ones that navigate this transition without unnecessary disruptions. The companies that wait too long risk losing access to the UK market altogether. UKCA marking is here to stay, and the regulatory framework will continue evolving. The best way forward is to stay informed, remain flexible, and start the transition now whilst you still have control over the process. If you still have any questions, now is the time to engage with regulatory experts, consult with UK approved bodies, and get a clear, actionable plan in place. The sooner you act, the smoother the transition will be. And remember, you can submit any further questions directly to us at ridian@ridianresourcehub.com. We're here to help. Aside from that, you can download our comprehensive UKCA compliance ebook and guide directly from our website, again at ridianresourcehub.com, or if you need expert guidance on navigating UKCA regulations, you can submit a contact form with your details, and one of our compliance specialists will be in touch. Aside from that, thank you for joining today's session. I hope you found it valuable. And as always, stay informed, stay compliant, and we'll see you next time.